Everybody, welcome to another episode of Life Talks. Today, I have Kristi Collins on. Kristi, thank you for joining me.
Hi, thanks for letting me be here, Michael.
Well, I just want to dive right into it because this is, I want to share your story. It's in Scars to Stars. I had Dina on here, and your story is really profound. And I think we're similar in the sense that we're both big fans of Christ and growing in his way instead of our own way. And in your story, I just wanted to share this to start out because it really resonated with me when you said, when you are in the midst of suffering, it's hard to see how God is working. But looking back, I can see that God was with me through it all. No, he didn't answer my prayers just the way that I wanted, but he was working in me. I will never know all the answers of why, but I believe that God is good. He does not cause us to suffer or wish suffering on us. Instead, he promises to work all things, even the worst situations, for our good and his glory. And I've recently just made my channel with born again men, and this idea of being born again, as I'm coming to see, in my view, is not just having water put on your head, but it's a way of seeing the world. And much of the time, we don't want to suffer, but in those periods of suffering, which I went through a lot in 2020 as well, we start to see clear the bigger picture. And to trust in God is very, it's we don't want to in those difficult times. So, if you could just share your story for people who don't know you and just dive into that.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share. So my husband and I, we walked through quite a journey, even before we struggled with infertility. My mom had passed away, and I'd gone through like a lot of different emotional things. So we went through a lot in that different seasons of change and suffering, and infertility was one of those things. And God just really felt like I was almost in a wilderness season, like, hey, God, I have all these things, and the things that I had wanted, like for my mom to get better, and she didn't, she passed away. And then for us to be able to have a baby, and we just could not have a baby. And finally somebody was like, hey, you should really go see like a specialist for that, or a fertility specialist. And I was like, well, that's a great idea. I hadn't even thought of that yet. And that was kind of the first part of our journey. But it's really hard not being able to conceive. So that struggle was, I don't really know how to
Well, the
explain
fact
it.
that you had said that you basically reached out for help, right? Like, hey, I need help, right? Because at least for
Yes.
me, the ego says, I'll handle this. I wrote in my story, I had struggled with porn, but it's not an issue that just, there's plenty of other people who do it. And once I was like, hey, you know what? Deep down in my heart, I knew this was a problem, right?
Yeah.
And I knew I couldn't do this alone. And it was, me trying to see the world in a clear way rather than, getting pulled into the world in Hollywood. I didn't, I didn't,
Yeah.
I had to sacrifice my own pride. And there's like, I feel like that's one of the biggest, that was the biggest thing. And I see that with everybody. So you speak about Papa, right?
Yeah.
Where, you're sharing this with other people where it's like, when you share problems with people, I realize it's like you open yourself up to judgment. And that was a big thing for me. I'm like, how am I going to tell other people about that? But what's really interesting is when you share that, you get to see who the real ones are in your life, and you get to see the ones who mock or judge you or distance. And it's
Yeah.
really like, it's refreshing. It's Christ-like, right? You're opening yourself up to other people, and you get to see who the real ones are, and you forgive those who really cast the judgment because they're still within their own minds. But maybe if you could talk a little bit about, when you were sharing that with Papa and who he is and how he helped, in your situation.
Oh yeah, with my grandpa. So yeah, just to go back a little bit, the suffering, and you're going through a season and you're like, God, what are we going to do? I've prayed and I don't know what to do. I don't, but I don't really have, I've fought you before, God, and it's not good. I've turned away from you before, and I don't want to go that way this time. So instead, I'm going to lean into you, even though I don't understand. And this was the part of suffering. And like I said, before this happened, we were in a season and I kind of did the opposite and turned away from God. And that was even worse. So I learned that, you know what, God, this time I do trust you, even though things aren't going my way. And I am going to humble myself, and I'm not going to try to do it all on my own. And I'm going to try to follow you follow you through this and trust you, even if it takes time, even if it doesn't make sense to me. I trust you, even if it hurts when it hurts. And I keep getting the same answer. You're not pregnant over and over again. It hurts. But I trust you. So, God really, we prayed and led us through, we kept getting, like a negative pregnancy test. We did something called an IUI, and we had done that 4 different times and it didn't work. And we had our hopes up so high, that it was going to work, and it didn't. And so my husband had finally decided, like, hey, you know what? I think it's time. This is way too emotionally difficult. We need to just think about doing IVF. And, everything in my life, I was like, I don't want to do that. There's so many chemicals that you have to put in your body. That's a lot of pressure on me. And like, there's procedures and stuff. And I was like, oh gosh, this was the last thing I want to do. And then I knew it, God was leading me down that path. And I was like, okay. And then I was like, well, let's pray about it, and it's really expensive. So this is kind of where my papa comes in, and we had prayed about it, and we're like, we can financially figure it out, but it'll be tough. It'll definitely strain things. Cause it costs, we were probably already in like $10,000 or $15,000 in the fertility treatments. And this costs like $25,000 to $30,000 before any of the other pregnancy appointments and all that stuff. If you do get pregnant, by the way, and it could not even work. So, we kind of told our family, hey, we talked to the doctor, we're going to do IVF, and, we're just going to figure it out. And so my grandpa, or my papa, and he just kind of thought about it, I guess. And my mom, like I said, had passed away, who was his daughter. And he just was really adamant. He's like, I want to help. I've thought about it. I want to help you. I want to be part of your journey. I don't know how. And, but I feel like we're supposed to pay for this. So I want to cover it. And I'm going to get together with the rest of your family, like all your other grandparents, and we are going to cover the cost. And I couldn't even believe it, because I was just astonished. It was like, I had prayed to God, like, hey, we're going to move forward with this, but I don't know how we're going to pay for it. And I think it was like a month or a month and a half later that I got this phone call, and I just knew it was God, and he was working through my grandpa. And he was like, hey, I want to help you and really just take the pressure off. So that's when I really knew that God was opening the doors. And I was like, wow, this is it. We've been waiting, and God's really given us the green lights to move forward, and we have support from our family. And they're going to cover, I think it was like $25,000 that my family ended up covering. So, which was the entire
no little
cost.
amount.
Yeah. And I was like, it takes all the pressure off of me and my husband, Bjorn, and allows us to focus on all the shots that you need to do, and
Which on top of it, I'm sure everyone's telling you, don't be stressed out, right? Because when you're in that state of like relaxation, it's like, that's, probably the most,
exactly
the most likely to conceive.
Yeah. So it was a huge weight off our shoulders. And I mean, that was just like one of the ways. And like you said earlier, you can't always see how God's working in you, especially in the midst of suffering. And I still don't know the answer why, I'm not going to know why. And I just don't think in this lifetime we're going to know the answer why to many things, many horrific things that happen to people, and my situation doesn't even compare to things that other people go through. But this was my personal struggle. And, it is hard when you struggle with infertility, and it is humbling. It's a humbling experience, like I said, where I feel like God is teaching me to learn to ask for help, and that it's okay to ask for help, and it doesn't make you less of a person. And God really wants us to learn, bring God back into this. But Christ said, my grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in weakness. So instead of trying to hide our weaknesses, let's bring them out of the dark, bring them to the surface.
I love that. It's just another paradox, right? It's like in the world, it's like, oh, I'm powerful because I'll do everything. It's like, no, it's in that weakness. Absolutely.
100%. So God said, my grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in your weakness, so therefore you can boast in your weaknesses, because when you are weak, I am strong. And I just feel like that's the story of my life. Like any testimony that I have to share of my life, where I have gone through horrible things, and if I've overcome them, it's not because of me, it's because of God. God has worked through my weakness and things that, even terrible things that have happened to me, like the death of my mother and the fertility struggle that I walked through. He used those things to show his glory and show that, he can do mighty and powerful things when we give him our weakness.
Yeah, absolutely. And then how did that transition from now you have a child? So that last piece of the puzzle, how did that play out for you?
Yeah. So I really think God does hear our prayers, and, he doesn't always answer them in the way that we want, but a lot of times he does. And sometimes it takes 8 years, I think, is how long we had been praying to have a baby.
Wow.
Or trying, on and off, trying, not trying, had been thinking about it though for about 8 years. And I mean, that's an answer to prayer. So I think it's just really a life lesson that God has used in my life to say, hey, I am working in the waiting. Like, I do move. I do hear your prayers. I'm not a silent, like, even when sometimes it seems like I am silent, I'm never absent. I'm always present. I'm always listening. So when you're going through painful times and you don't understand, like, bring all that to God. He can handle it. He can handle your questions when you say, why, God? Why are you letting me go through this? And you may not know the answer, and you may never know it, but he does. And even when we don't understand, we can trust him that he's going to carry us out of that season. And he's even going to use bad things that happen to us for good. Like for me, my character has changed to just learn to be more, I guess, to learn to wait on the Lord and to be patient with him. And not just take things into my own hands, like I've done so many times, or to even turn away from God. Like I said, like, God, he is a faithful God, but it doesn't always, that doesn't mean that everything's going to go the way we think it should go, and that we're not going to have suffering. I think what it means that God to be faithful is that he's loving, he cares for us, and he's never going to leave us, and he's going to take care of us. So even when we are suffering, we can go back to that, and going through a hard time, we can trust him that he is good, and he is going to take care of us.
Yeah, I think from what I take from that, at least from how I've seen it, it's the ability to really stay neutral. And I think it's very difficult because I think there's a fluctuation between pride and apathy. Because sometimes, there's so many levels of paradoxes. So, for example, God helps those who help themselves, right? So in times where we shouldn't be apathetic, to step up and do what we can to be proactive, but other times, right, to really be humble. And I think, like, to really grow in wisdom, it's like you have to completely let go. And, it's so subtle because, I would say, especially in our culture now, where it's like everyone's a victim. And we're pedestalizing victims. Oh, you're a victim. Everybody's a victim. And it's like, no, you're not a victim, but to understand what true surrender is not, it's so subtle. So I can definitely, to be weak at the wrong time is not God's timing. So I think, maybe if we can transition there, like, what is, prayer to you? Like, is it a source of meditation? Is it silence and letting God speak? What is that to you for people who are, interested in prayer and so on?
Yeah. So prayer to me, I mean, it can kind of take on many different forms. It can be meditation. It can be just silence and listening. If you are listening to hear God, really, it's about a relationship and an intimacy with God. So prayer, I mean, a lot of people think of prayer as something really fancy, or that you need to be all put together. And that is such a lie. Prayer is really communion.
All right, we just got disconnected, but interesting.
Sorry.
You said prayer is communion. We are communications went out, but
Yes.
prayer is communion was the last thing that you had said.
Yeah. So I was just kind of talking about that. I think there's like over 3,000 questions in the Bible of when people were praying. So a lot of, if you read the Bible, which is really our, you know, how we understand who God is and how he interacts with people and what his character is like but people ask questions to God and he responds to those questions. And then Jesus even asked questions like through his teaching, and he asked questions to people. So a lot of prayer, an honest prayer, is really asking questions. So, and that's learning to, you know, because it's not just a cookie cutter faith. It's a real faith, an authentic faith where you can talk to God and you could be yourself, and you can question him, you can be upset with him because he can handle those things. And so that's what prayer looks like to me. It can be worship, it can be talking to him, but it's also, if you're not okay, it's instead of turning away from God, it is going to God and saying, God, I'm not okay. Because sometimes wrestling with God is intimacy with God too, and not being okay, but choosing to come to him anyway is like a form of prayer, and you know, is a real relationship with somebody. And I know that God wants that.
Radical truth, internal dialogue, right? And just being real. Yeah. And it's deeply intimate within yourself. And you know, it's, from what I've really seen, it's something that is, you know, you wrote here in the book too, and this is one of the reasons why I made my channel, because you said trust God. Sounds cliche, doesn't it? Because I think of the younger version of myself, and anytime I hear someone be like, you have to trust in Jesus, there's something in me that just like turned me off. Like I was really looking for someone who was just real. And like what's so interesting is I feel like, you know, I talk a lot with men, and what is it to be a man? Heavy question in our culture, right? And it's funny, as I've really focused more on Christ, what I've come to realize is that a strong man, and I think a strong woman too, is peace, is someone who in the midst of adversity is calm, and you know it when you're around them. You can feel it intuitively when someone's at peace or someone's disconnected. And I feel like, especially now with all the craziness going on, those who are truly in alignment with God are just those who are at peace in the midst of chaos. Like that to me seems, and I think you only, to your point, is, which two things came to mind, is one, what Christ said is seek the truth, right? It's really that simple. Seek and ye shall find. But how many times do we want to, like, you know, we've spoken earlier, just we don't want to ask the questions. We don't want to humble ourselves and say, hey, I don't know, I need help, right? And the other one is, which I think ties in with it, is in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, we have to become again like a child. And I've thought a lot about that. What does that mean? And I think the way it ties into that is that, what is a kid always doing? Why? And they're going, their minds are like a sponge. I'm sure you know, you could teach me on, you know, as far as what it's like to have you know, a child, and you know, we all learn from each other on how to, you know, to nourish that curiosity, because we're giving the answers that we know, and we can also learn from their whys, right? Because, like, you know, I think radical honesty is important with children, right? Is that you know, I mean, not that you're going to tell them all life's difficulties at a young age, but that, you know, that teaching like God's authority versus I'm right, I'm the parent, I'm right, I think can create a lot of resentment for children, right? And that's why I think in our culture, a lot of people can, you know, they have those teenage years, at least I have, you know, that rebellion years. And I think the strongest way that that's confronted is that, like, hey, we're all sons and daughters of God. Me personally don't have the answers. Those answers are within you. And the best parent, I think, can hold a mirror onto there. That's what I think the best relationships would be, to be to hold a mirror, to find those answers within. The best advice I can give you is, what do you think? And that's such a paradox too, right? Because we want those simple answers, but, you know, maybe if you could share on that, does that resonate? Like, is that something that, you know, totally. Yeah.
I mean, the whole, just even like you said, the trust God, and you know what, that is cliche. And it's
yeah, like someone who's a complete atheist listen to this and go, what the heck are you talking about? What does that mean? You know?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it's something that I think it's like when you're working out, it's a muscle that learns muscle memory, and trusting God doesn't just come. That's not something that happens. So for someone who's been walking with God for many, many years and seen him do many things, if you're like, oh, just trust God to somebody, they're not going to understand that. And they need, another thing is, like, the experiences people are going through are real, and they're hard, and they're difficult. And that also needs to be seen, and our God is the God who sees. Like, he sees you, he values you, but he sees your suffering, he sees your difficulty, and he acknowledges that. So he wants you to trust him, but he also wants you to know that I see your pain, I care about you, and then I'm asking you to trust me. So it's so much deeper than just trusting God. And I think, that can sound cliche, but it's really about a relationship, and that building that because you're not going to trust somebody you don't know, right? So if you
Yeah.
don't know Christ, why are you going to trust him? You wouldn't. But if you get to know him, and you know that he is our savior, and he redeems you, and he heals you, and he restores you, and who Christ really is, if you learn how good he is, and you can trust him, that's when you can trust him, right? So that's a process. And it's something that people, you shouldn't expect people to just know how to do that, right? And
Yeah.
you would want to walk alongside people who are saying, I can't trust God right now, and I'm struggling with that. And that's okay. And God can handle that. And so I think it's learning that God's bigger than, our doubts, and he can handle wrestling. He can handle doubts. He can handle hard seasons. He can handle times when we feel like he's far away and we're struggling with him. He can handle that. So it's a process, it's a journey, and everybody's looks different, but we're here together to encourage each other. And that's why the church, I believe, is so important. It's that we're called to encourage each other and come alongside each other and support one another in that journey.
So I completely agree, 100%. I wanted to also ask, as far as, because like I mentioned, I've recently gotten engaged, and maybe if you could share some advice for people who are trying to grow in Christ together. I can speak somewhat openly about in my relationship, that my hunger for Christ has grown so much, and that I'm trying to lead in a way where it's not forcing, right? Because as I think what would Jesus do, right, in certain situations, to force people to Christ is not, to me, Christian, right?
No.
And my fiance is on board with everything, but we were raised differently. My mother was very much into the church, and that definitely had influence, whereas her family wasn't as much. And I'm learning along the way. So maybe if you could share, any advice that you give to me and other people like-minded who are trying to strengthen that bond, and things that we can do that I think give a strong foundation to maybe you and your husband, and what it's like to be a mother, and how to raise, I know she's still very young, but any advice you would give for people who are like-minded on that same path.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for asking. It's a really, really great question. So I would say, first and foremost, that my greatest advice for any marriage is to have Jesus. Because if Jesus isn't in it, and the storms of life, it's not a question of if they will come, it's a question of when they will come. Life is hard, and you need a solid rock. And so my number one piece of advice is that Christ is the solid rock of any marriage, and nobody's perfect. He gives us grace. He models forgiveness. He models compassion, and he models servantship. And that's what marriage is about. It's about serving one another, in love, and serving one another in love, and lifting each other up. That's what God made marriage for, was that. It's not supposed to be an oppressive thing, and talking about masculinity, that's God's plan for the man, is to be the servant of his household, and to be the leader too, but also to be a servant, and to be humble, and to respect his wife, or the wife to respect him, but for him to love his wife. So it's really cool how God made marriage for people, and how it really mirrors our relationship with Christ, and even the Trinity as well. So yeah, making Christ the center of your marriage would be my number one recommendation. And second would be that you personally cannot change anybody. So no matter how hard you try, and I was actually listening to this podcast yesterday by Pastor Craig Russell with Life Church, and he's so awesome. It was a marriage podcast, and it was about how you can try as hard as you want to change someone, and you can't, because God is the only one who can change people. So what do you do if you want somebody to change? You pray. You start praying for them, and you pray. And that's been something hard for me, and something I learned, because I love to, everybody loves to be in control and wants to change things, or, have it your way. But it's learning that you're not in control, and we can't change people, but Christ can. And that's, again, where Jesus comes into the marriage. And it's so important, because we're growing and we're learning together, and you need to pray for each other. And it's not a 50-50 relationship. It's not 50-50, because then people will start to resent each other. What it is, it's 100-100. Both spouses give 100%. I learned that on the podcast yesterday. So I can't take credit for that, but I was like, that is so good.
That's funny. My dad says the same thing. He says you can't have a half person, you have to have a whole person. And I think that's really where the foundation is within each of our own hearts, our own walk with God, truth.
Yep. But I think that's really important, is that, you're showing up to give 100%, and they're showing up to give 100%, and you're willing to work with someone, and knowing that when you commit in marriage, you're going to go through really hard times, for better, for worse. And like I said, you're going to want Christ, but you're also going to want to have that understanding that you're going to need that grace, and you're going to need that forgiveness, given and to give. So it's just knowing Jesus really does, as your personal Lord and Savior, and serving him changes everything for your marriage. And if you have that, it's never too late to have it, but if you can have it now, why wouldn't you? Right? So that would be my advice.
I wanted to ask you one thing on something you said, the idea that a man is to be a servant. And I've reflected on that idea, and I talk a lot with guys and girls of like, what is the role of a man and a woman in a relationship? And the best that I've come up with in my own experience is that when a man is submissive to Christ, meaning that his bedrock is on Christ, the foundation is on that, and he speaks in his words and his actions, the right woman would follow him. I believe that the man is supposed to be the head of the household. One of the problems that we've had in our culture is we've had so many weak men. Mm-hmm. And I think a sign of also a weak man is someone who appears that he's in control, but he's not in control. He's domineering and not a dominant man. And the difference I would describe that as is a domineering man is he controls other people. He tells other people how they need to live, versus a dominant man focuses all of his energy on doing the right thing for its own sake. And you can see it in his words and his actions. And for a long time, I wasn't that guy. I was trying to be the alpha guy, or I was trying to be the tough guy. And I would see that pushback from, girls that I would date in my life. And as I've really grown in that, to me, I think there's an epidemic of women who are looking for men who are leaders. What are your views on that, and how that plays out in, the church and in life, and your views?
Yeah, 100%. I think that our culture today is really, I think, like you said, there's an epidemic of, you could really say on both sides, but of men who are wanting to serve Christ, right? And who want to put Christ first. Because like you said, that relationship with Christ, and when they choose to surrender, is the bedrock of understanding what you're supposed to be as a husband in a marriage, right? Because Jesus was a servant to all. Like it says in the Bible that Jesus came not to be served like a king, but to serve. Again, the upside down kingdom, the paradox, right?
Yeah.
So, Jesus wants husbands to be the leader. I do believe that he set them as the leader and the protector of the household, right? As the man. But leadership to Christ doesn't look always like the world wants it to, as the world has it to look, right? And to be some strong, dominant, I'm in charge and I'm going to control everything. It's never supposed to be oppressive and pushing down. And my pastor just talked about this too. Christ made marriage to lift up. So, and they kind of talk about that, the toxic masculinity, and how, males are very oppressive. But again, Christ was never like that, and he never intended marriage to be like that. So masculinity is a good thing, right? It's made by God, right?
Yeah.
God made man and woman, and he made us so different to complement each other.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
that's so special. So I think God is, in this generation, is creating men that are new leaders, like you said, that are willing to be on their knees before Christ, and that are willing to serve their families and put Christ first, and that aren't to try to control and run the show, because they know that they can't. We are all going to fall short, and we find that out on our own, which would not be fun, or you could submit to God and do it his way, because his way is always better. But I think you're right.
Yeah, which to me, because I always think of like younger version of me watching this, like how it would speak to that. To me, when the God is truth. So truth is the highest way of living, right? And Christ exemplified that. So to follow Christ is to follow truth. And when you go within, you say, well, what, I think of it like this, is like, what would be the highest game to play? How can I play this game where I win and everyone else around me wins? And what does winning mean? Right. And to me, is winning is the ability to not, and I sent you a clip yesterday with one of the guys I did a podcast with, Jerry. And one of the things that he says is that, he called out hypocrites, right? So the ability to call out hypocrites is really, to me, one of the aspects of a protector. And the problem is you have to start with yourself. And that, to me, that's really the core of prayer. That inner hypocrite, you think about all the actions and all the things that I've done. Who am I to judge? And it's such a beautiful thing when you think about it, because it forces you to have that internal and that wrestling, within that's led me to really point out my own hypocrisy more and more. Where I point like, hey, we've all fallen short of that. It's bear your cross and move forward. And I'm in complete agreement. And God's timing is really, I've really reflected on that recently, the idea of God's speed. I used to hear that when I was younger in like movies, God's speed. I'm really inclined to say that more and more now, because it's God's timing. You have no idea in the whole scheme of things how, it's supposed to go, and I think your story really is a testament to exactly that, that if you're going through difficult things, especially I want a baby now, right? It's our timing, not, God's timing, but if in closing, if there's anything you wanted to say, you mentioned your Instagram where people can follow you, because you're not alone and other women are not alone. If, they wanted to reach out to you, is that something that you would want? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's any women out there that are struggling with infertility, or just honestly loss, if you've lost anybody in your life and you're going through a hard season and you're just struggling to understand where God is, and like I said, whether it's fertility or grief, I would love to talk to you, and I'd love to pray with you and be an encouragement, because God does work in the suffering. Like I said, it's hard to see it. Like Michael was saying, it's hard to see in that season while you're in it, but he's working, and we don't always know how, but we can know that he sees us, and he sees our suffering, and he cares, and he is good, and we can trust him.
Yeah, absolutely. So where can people find you?
Yes, the Instagram is the Sunshine Machine. So yep, just the Sunshine Machine.
All right, I'll put that underneath. Kristi, I appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.